jQuery. Now, the JavaScript that we were looking at today is very simple JavaScript. Most browsers understand that same JavaScript we were talking about. But when you start talking about some of the more advanced features in JavaScript, some of the different vendors of these browsers have somewhat deviated from each other, right? Always because there has been a war, a competition amongst different vendors, Safari and Chrome and IE, God forbid, or all these other vendors are trying to compete, right, in this space, right, and each one kind of pulling on their own. It says, hey, look at these really great features. Why don't we, trying to attract developers to their platform? Yes. So the versions of JavaScript amongst the vendors has diverged, and also different versions of JavaScript language itself has also fragmented a bit. Yes, and this has driven developers, to really have a challenge on how do we deal with so many different versions of JavaScript, right? We don't have control over the version of the browser of whoever's on the other side that's consuming our content. Yes, so we have to write our code in such a way that it can run successfully in any number of vendors and versions of the language. Yes, and this is very, very hard. Usually you tend to have lots and lots of code inside of a JavaScript. Trying to figure out what vendor is there that I'm running in. Do I have this function available? Do I have that feature available? Right, and try to adapt your code to different types of vendors, different versions of the language. And it was just a nightmare, right? You ended up having code with lots of switch statements saying, if I have this feature and it's this vendor and that, in this version, then do this, right? If you have this other vendor, this feature, this version, then do that, okay? And it was just a nightmare to maintain. It's really ugly code. So what jQuery did is says, okay, you know what? I'm going to grab all those ifs and switches and whatnot. I'm going to make a library out of that, right? And so that you will never have to do that yourself. Right, so instead of writing your code down to the low-level JavaScript, write instead to this very thin layer of abstraction. Yes, and I'll figure out the rest. Right, if you tell me that you want a button that's going to be clicked and you want me to notify you, fine. This is a function .click, and I'll notify you when somebody clicks that. Right, and you can forget. Whether it's Chrome or Firefox or Safari, and what version it is, and if it has this feature or not, I'll do that all for you. I'll just guarantee you this type of functionality. So you just have to learn about jQuery, what the functionality is, right, and what the API is. Make sense? Right. So jQuery, that's how it began. It has a huge success. Folks don't almost never now write JavaScript. Down to the low-level JavaScript. Usually, they'll use an intermediate library such as jQuery, and jQuery by far is the most popular out there, right? If other than single-page libraries such as React and whatnot, and even some of these libraries underneath they use jQuery, right? To actually talk to the DOM, right? To do some of the transformations. So installing jQuery is very simple. At the head. What the? All right, whatever. Okay, so installing is very easy. You can either download it and copy it locally on your machine, or we can do what we did with Bootstrap, right? We can go to a CDN, right, and download the jQuery. There's quite a few versions. As newer versions have come up, these newer versions kind of dropped off some of the older browsers, right, and assume a minimum version of the browser, which is some of these assumptions make sense, right? With many folks going with new operating systems, new versions of their browsers and whatnot. Again, the preferred way is to use the CDN URL. All right, so jQuery, what jQuery does is that something that we told you not to do. It declares a global function. All right. And when you become as famous as jQuery, go ahead and declare your own global function, all right? But meanwhile, don't declare global functions, right? So what jQuery has done is that it has declared this global function. When you load the library, it declares this single function called jQuery, right? Spelled out this way, J uppercase Q. JavaScript is case sensitive, and this function is very powerful, right? Depends what you pass it, it behaves one way or another. Okay. Most of the times, what you pass this function is CSS, a string that is a CSS selector. Okay, and it uses this CSS string to query the document. That's why it's called jQuery. Very much like in HTML databases, you have SQL, right? You have query, a structured query language, and you have select statements and whatnot, and you provide your criteria, and select all the employees where from this employee table where they were make so many salary, minimum salary, maximum salary, whatnot. Yes, you query the table. Yes, here we're using jQuery to query the document, right? The document object model. So you can say, hey, give me all the paragraphs. Now that I have all the paragraphs, okay, what do you want to do with them? Okay, add 3 more paragraphs. Change the 3rd paragraph to something else. I want the foreground color, change it to something else. Go fetch me data from the server and replace this content with this JSON object, right? So that's what jQuery allows you to do, right? Query the document and then manipulate the document, right, with a higher level API. Everybody okay? All right. So usually the syntax is jQuery followed by the selector. Selector, it will be some CSS rule, right? So that you can with a CSS rule you can refer to any element on the page. Yes.
So in that case, would we include like either the pound sign or the
Yep.
dot?
Yeah, it's a full-blown CSS selector. Yep. Okay. Right. So that's the most common use. But again, the jQuery function is very powerful. You can also instead of passing it a CSS selector, you can also pass it a full-blown HTML string, right, with H1s and paragraphs. And what it'll do is says, oh, you don't want to select anything on the document. You want to create brand new content, right? And then it'll create a document. It'll create an object model, right, in memory, not in the page. And then you can once you have this content, you can do whatever you want to it. You can append it to the bottom of the screen, right? You can replace content that was already there and just swap other content dynamically, right? You can create content on the side, right? And then programmatically add it and manipulate and append it any which way you want. The content is already there. So usually after the selector, usually there's some action. What is it that you want to do with it? You can dot delete, you can dot remove, you can dot click, you can dot whatever. You can change the CSS, you can do whatever, a whole bunch of things in transformation. You can append to it, you can append after it, before it, in the middle, at the bottom, at a particular index. There's all sorts of transformations that are available. Now, because we are so lazy, and 6 characters is too long, right? And one of them is a uppercase. We have an alias, the $, right? The $, is an alias, right? That allows you to very quickly do the same exact thing, right? So $, is an alias to the jQuery function. Yeah, right. So let's look at some examples. So for instance, here we're saying, jQuery, go grab me all the paragraphs, right? All of them. Every single one of them. And what I want to do, I want to apply the following action. The action is I want to change their CSS, I want to change the color, and I want to set it to red. And this changes all the paragraphs. It grabs them, it comes back as an array, right? It iterates over them, and then applies the transformation to all of them. Very, very powerful. Here's another example. Grab all the elements who have a class that is details, right? And then hide them. Right? Poof, they're gone. Well, they're still in the DOM. They just are the display changes to none, right? So boom, you don't see them, and then you can show them again, right? And you can toggle, right, content on and off, right? Here's another one. Grab me an element who has an ID called name, right? And this is .val. So apparently this might be an input field. This might be an input field, and I want to grab whatever the input field, whatever the user has typed in that input field, grab it, and then store it in a local variable here, name. Yes?
This is sort of like an outside question, but is there much like security concern when you use like other libraries like jQuery? And is there like I guess a threshold to like consider when like convenience over that risk?
Yeah, well, not jQuery in particular. So most of these libraries, presumably, the community has most of them are open source, and the community has been on top of this for years. And you can see all the millions of downloads, and so people are following all these security risks, and they usually will be well known and reported in these. Yes.
I saw at least for CSS that you can have an integrity tag that checks
Yep.
the
True.
checksum.
Yep. Yeah, that too, right? So when you're downloading them, right, so you can append to the download a checksum to make sure that if you're downloading it, it's from the right source and whatnot. Yep. Yeah. Thanks. Initializing them. Also, I mentioned earlier, right, that you have to be careful, in the order in which you load these libraries, right, because the document that you intend to manipulate might not have loaded yet, right? And so you might be referring to all these input fields and these paragraphs, and they have not yet been parsed by the browser, right? It hasn't gotten to it yet, right? So you have to be careful. One way to fix this is either the simplest thing to do is to put your code all the way at the bottom, right? That means that it's the very last thing that executes, even though it's not the proper place to put it. Usually all your CSS, all your libraries should be referenced in the head of your document, right? Oftentimes we put them at the bottom of the body tag, right? Even though it's not syntactically correct, it's the browser just says fine, I'll download it, I'll load it the very last thing that I do. That guarantees that the document has already been loaded, right? All the DOM exists, and now when you're going to refer to it, right, it's there. Make sense? Otherwise, if you put it at the top, right, it's going to execute, it's going to try and fetch all thare elements, and they're not there yet, right? So to get around this and make sure that you are indeed manipulating elements that are indeed have been loaded, what we can do is to use the jQuery function, right, and wrap the document object. Notice that the jQuery function is very powerful. I told you, right? It can take strings, right, and the strings could be either CSS or it could be an actual HTML element, right? Or it can take as argument a function. If it, it can take an object, right? It can take an object, and if it sees that object, it's going to check on the DOM. Right? It's going to look at the DOM and says, "Hey DOM, are you done? Have you loaded the entire document? If you are, right? What it does is that it puts an onload event handler on the body and so that it gets notified when the document hasn't completely loaded, right? And then once it loads, you can then register a callback function here that when it's ready to call your function, and then inside here you would put all your code of what is it you want to do with all the documents. Yes? Right? Now, there's an alias to that. The alias is to declare an actual init function, some init function, and that init function you can pass it to the $, and you pass it the function. This does exactly the same thing. It's going to establish an event handler on the unload of the document, and when the document loads, it will call the function that you tell it, right? And in that function, you can do all your processing, right? Another way of doing it without actually creating a function, because if you create a function, you're littering the namespace, right? So one alternative way of doing it is to just use an anonymous function, right? An anonymous function doesn't have a name. You're not littering the namespace, right? It says, okay, call this function whenever it loads, and then you can put all your code in there. Make sense? All right? And we'll play around with that in a bit. We have the click events, right? That you can grab an element like a paragraph and say, hey, if anybody clicks this, right, I want to be notified, right? You can either you can either provide an event handler so that if somebody clicks it, this function will execute, or you can programmatically click it. You can send a click event as if somebody actually clicked it with the mouse. Right? You can generate a click event, or you can listen for a click event and be notified when it is generated. See that? Right? This is very common. That the same function will behave differently depending on whether it has an argument or doesn't have an argument. Like if you were overloading a function, right? Even though JavaScript doesn't support overloading, right? The functions are written in such a way that they look like they're overloaded, right? It's the same function. It looks to see if there's an argument, not an argument. It'll behave one way or another, right? If it has a function, what it'll do is that it will put an event handler and will call it if somebody click it. So yeah, that's very common in JavaScript. Same function, different set of arguments, and typically it'll behave like a read one way, but it'll behave like a write another way, right? So if you pass it with no arguments, it'll be a read, and if you pass it with an argument, it'll be a write. It's a very common pattern in JavaScript, and we'll continue more on this tomorrow. Okay, thank you.